this. I've brought this editorial from Fox Business, basically countering what the president has said about the allegedly improving economy. Some would say. I thought it would be pertinent to excerpt his actual speech that he gave on July 24th, and I'm going to read you a portion of that. So let's start by, before we get to the editorial, let's delve into the speech of his. So he says, in the period after World War II, a growing middle class was the engine of prosperity. Whether you owned a company or swept its floors or worked anywhere in between, this country offered you a basic bargain, a sense that your hard work would be rewarded with fair wages and decent benefits, the chance to buy a home, to save for retirement, and most of all, a chance to hand down a better life for your kids. But over time, that engine began to stall. It became harder for unions to fight for the middle class. Washington doled out bigger tax cuts to the wealthy and smaller minimum wage increases to the working poor. Franco, do you agree with these remarks by the president?
It's very difficult to live on a minimum wage. I would say that the economy is steadily improving, but
Yes. Let's bring Annika into this. Annika, after hearing the first part of that speech by the president given on July 24th, remarks on the economy, do you agree with these remarks by the president?
It's kind of hand in hand. It's like if they are bringing the money in, if you want them to spend the money in the States, reinvest it in our economy, give them a reason to do it. If not, they're going to base themselves somewhere else. If they have that much money, they're just going to base themselves somewhere else and have their legal residence in another country, for example.
Well, to play devil's advocate with your point, on one hand, you have the argument that the bourgeoisie are, quote-unquote job creators. But on the other hand, I think critics to what you are saying would say, even when we lower taxes and give them, benefits and give them exemptions or what have you, they still will invest in overseas tax shelters. So is that really helping revenue of this country?
Well, they'll invest less in the overseas tax shelters if their taxes are higher, they're going to get rid of as much of that money as they can. I think that he's oversimplifying the situation.
Okay, yes, I mean, I can understand that. And so...
So I think that's part of it, where the economy has just completely changed.
In terms of there's more concentrated at the top and at the very bottom.
Yes.
Yeah, so
it's concentration at the very top, and there's concentration at the very bottom.
And that's what that sort of,
I think the middle class is completely starting to vanish.
Yeah, and that's where we hear this idea of, quote, the disappearing middle class. I'm going to move on to the next part in this speech. So the president goes on to say, and so what happened was that the link between higher productivity and people's wages and salaries was broken. It used to be that as companies did better, as profits went higher, workers also got a better deal. And that started changing. So the income of the top 1% nearly quadrupled from 1979 to 2007, but the typical family's income barely budged. And towards the end of those 3 decades, a housing bubble, credit crash, a churning financial sector was keeping the economy artificially juiced up. So sometimes it papered over some of these long-term trends. This growing inequality, not just of result, inequality of opportunity. This growing inequality is not just morally wrong, it's bad economics. And if you ask some of these folks mostly in the House about their economic agenda, how is it that they'll strengthen the middle class? They'll shift the topic to out-of-control government spending, despite the fact that we've cut the deficit by nearly half as a share of the economy since I took office. Or they'll talk about government assistance for the poor, despite the fact that they've already cut out early education for vulnerable children. They've already cut insurance for people who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Franco, do you agree with these statements? Are these topics like out-of-control government spending and government assistance being used to deflect from the erosion of the American class system?
I would say that. I would say that
Well, I think what we're getting at here is, do you think that these issues of the out-of-control government spending, quote unquote, and government assistance are being used to deflect from erosions of the middle class? Let me ask you, Annika, I would ask you the same question. Do you agree with what the president is saying here? Are these topics to deflect from, the eroding middle class, allegedly?
No, I don't think so. I think that, whichever, like the article says, depending on which politician is doing the talking, you'll always get a different answer.
So you think that...
It'll always be the other guy's fault, the other party, the other branch of government.
So...
And that's exactly what it is.
So you think that, quote, out-of-control government spending and government assistance are legitimate concerns? Okay, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. If you do believe that the out-of-control government spending and the government assistance are legitimate issues, is this inequality of opportunity that the president brings up in this speech, is that a legitimate concern as well?
I don't really think so. I think when you start out, there are scholarships. The middle class are the ones that have the hardest time, I think. There are more scholarships available for really poor than there are for the average middle class.
Well, isn't there more to poverty, wealth, and opportunity than scholarships?
As far as
what I was basically getting at is you all start out with the same.
No.
You actually have more opportunity to do things. If you're very poor, you can actually, get the scholarship to go to school.
Okay.
To better yourself, to move up.
Well, you're bringing up one. Okay, in this one area, perhaps it is more available to people who are in the proletariat or working class, what have you. I think there are a lot of people who would say that's a pittance compared to the much greater picture. And you said everyone starts off with the same.
Oh no, what I mean by starting out is, you're required to get X amount of education, and unfortunately, the quality of education is all about the testing. You don't go to school to learn. You go to school to pass the test so that your school gets funding. So, in that sense, everyone has the same shot because the quality of education is...
Well, that's not exactly true, because in this country we do have a legalized system of private and home education. So to say that every person is going through that system is incorrect, and many times it's the more fortunate students like I was who could afford to go to a private school.
There's a bare minimum.
Pardon?
In that system. There's a bare minimum in the system that, everyone is entitled to an education.
But that doesn't eliminate class distinction or poverty.
Well,
and it certainly doesn't level the playing field.
There are so many people that come from nothing that make something.
Sure.
There are so many people that come from something that make nothing.
Sure, absolutely. But wouldn't you say people...
We are not a communist or a socialist society.
That is true.
We are absolute, we're not even a democracy. We are a society based on greed.
So we need...
It is strictly a greed-based
So
society.
if we have to understand that reality, we have to own the fact that there is an inequality of opportunity here. That's what the system is based upon.
Well, yes and no.
Because how can you say that it's based on greed, but then not agree with it?
There are people that have nothing and can make something. It's not just a matter of what you're born with. It's a matter of how you use the opportunities.
For sure, but my point is to recognize what people start out with, what those resources are. In their family, maybe, the savings and inheritance, land as wealth, tradition of going to school. All of those things are huge determiners of later class membership and economic status, and a lot of those things are inherited.
See, I don't think they're inherited. I really don't.
And you know what? But a lot of people, like I was lucky because I had so many people in my family who had gone to college before. The tradition extended before me. People were there to encourage me. We were upper middle class. We knew how to work the system. What I am saying that you can say that people have... listen to me. Let me finish. You can say that people, in this country, you have the opportunity to scale up, but not everyone had the resources that I had, and they never will. And you know what? And I'm going to admit it to say that I am a beneficiary of this class system, but that does not blind me from the fact that it does not give...
Every college has a financial aid office. All the high schools have guidance counselors.
Sure, but colleges having financial aid is not going to stop the growing inequality in this country.
I mean, I don't know.
Well, Annika, I want to go back to your point because
I am not a fan of this man. I think he is very good at double talk and bullshit. And he says... He's very good at double talk. He'll say the same thing 4 different ways, but each time he says it, he makes you believe a different thing. That's his thing.
But can I go back to what you've said previously? I just want you to clarify. So you say that, you reject this notion of the inequality of opportunity, but at the same time, you do recognize income inequality, or can you just clarify again your position on that?
No, it is there to an extent, but I think if you give enough of a shit, you can work around it.
You have to understand that these conceptions of success are molded by the environments in which we are influenced by, in which we grow up in.
I understand that, and I come from a family where, one parent has had college and the other one didn't.
Yeah.
And I was told growing up, you will go to college, you will work your ass off, and you will do this. And financially, it didn't work out, and I didn't get to go to college. I started and stopped, and I still don't have a bachelor's degree.
Correct.
Which I need. I mean, I'm running into brick wall after brick wall.
Yeah.
And trying to go back to college as a 40-year-old, I mean, there's very little in the way of scholarship available for a 40-year-old.
It's really just such a tough thing. And all these colleges really trump the fact that they help non-traditional students. But I've seen it firsthand. The failure rate is way too high. And for these are the people, these non-traditional students, they need the college degree the most.
Colleges want to make money.
Yeah.
Yeah. They really want to make money.
But also, colleges get funding from the federal government when they enroll non-traditional students, and then they don't support them enough.
Right, because once they get their money, they're done.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on to the last part of the speech from the excerpt from the speech, He said, but with this endless parade of distractions and political posturing and phony scandals, Washington has taken its eye off the ball. And I'm here to say this needs to stop. This needs to stop. We need a long-term American strategy based on steady, persistent effort to reverse the forces that have conspired against the middle class for decades. I would ask this question of you guys. It has been a very common question in the right-wing media this week. The question is, the IRS scandal, the Benghazi scandal, NSA surveillance scandal, are these phony scandals like the president characterizes them to be? Franco?
As far as the Benghazi attacks, I don't know. I am sorry to say, but when you go into that type of work, when you go overseas to an area that has anti-American feelings,
yes,
I would think that you would be expected that you will be attacked, you will be kidnapped.
I would ask the same thing to you, Annika. Are these phony scandals?
I don't think they're phony, but I do think they're blown out of proportion because the economy is a thorn in the president's side, and he wants us all to forget about it. And even though Benghazi's bad, the leak, it's bad, but, it shows that they're spies. Oh, goodness, America spies on people. Of course we do.
Well, but there was a little, and we did cover it on this show. There's a little more than just kind of humdrum spying. Our spying
is. But I'm saying, I think a lot of it is blown out of proportion because any government official, they want to be seen in the best possible light.
Well, this makes the government look bad. Why would they blow this out of proportion?
Well, because if one thing is worse than the other, the economy affects every single American citizen. Every single one of us.
Well, I have to ask you a question which exposes maybe a flaw in your thinking. The same outlets that are trumpeting these what President Obama calls phony scandals are also ones who are very opposed to him and very critical of his handling of the economy as well.
Right, but he's not saying Fox is the only one doing it.
Well, I think that it's targeted towards that sector of the media.
Right, but I am a registered Republican.
Yeah.
And, I did not vote for Obama. I didn't like him from day one. I thought he was full of it. I thought he had a bit of a God complex. I still think he does. I like him even less now. I did like some of what he said he was going to do. He said he was going to, legalize same-sex marriage. Repeal donors don't tell. Well, he did, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He did, but he was forced to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, because there was so much opposition on those two issues.
If Biden had not opened his mouth, Obama would not have done it.
Yeah, it's true.
Every single politician makes promises that they can't keep. That's part of the course.
And when it comes to same-sex marriage and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he really, he made those promises early on, waited so many years to the point where liberals finally got so up in arms that he was essentially forced to.
Exactly. He was supposed to close Guantanamo Bay.
Oh, that's the biggest lie ever. Yeah, still open. So let's, in the final piece of this, he literally quoting, forces that have conspired against the middle class. He never explicitly mentions these forces. What do you think he's referring to? Franco.
Forces. I'm going to have to think about this for a moment.
Okay, let's go to Annika. What forces is he referring to?
Oh, exactly. He is talking about the evil Republican empire plotting just to overthrow his presidency. Come on.
I think that's a little bit naive of him.
Yeah. Himself.
Who does he think he is? But you know what? There's a lot of people that will sort of, they see Republican and Democrat as black and white. They don't see the bigger picture that they are part of this capitalist class, they're part of the bourgeoisie, they're part of our political class, whatever you want to call it, elite, whatever. He is just as elitist as them.
A poor president.
No.
Obama had a shitload of money.
Ivy League education.
Money to become president.
Yeah.
Forces that are pushing against the middle class. There are so many forces out there that will just keep trying to push us down, keep trying to repel us from our prospects, from our dreams. So it's really, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. These forces, I'm sorry, I just
What?
I just think it's this humdrum, basically.
What's humdrum?
These forces against middle class,
I think Franco's having a Sarah Palin moment. Shall we move on?
This has been beaten to death.
The imagined middle class.
Oh, poor me, with regards to this. If all if they weren't attacking me politically, then I could get this and that and the other thing done.
Yeah.
But Republicans are stopping everything from happening.
That's the subtext
exactly
here, yeah.
what he's been doing for the longest time.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's my kind of take on this. You said that, kind of this message is being beaten over the head. I mean, I agree that this has been a theme of his presidency. But the thing is, I think it needs to be said more, and it needs to be backed up with actual policy. I don't think that the Obama administration has much to show for it, and while the right criticizes him for even the mildest of liberal positions economically, really, has his presidency done much to mollify growing income inequality in the United States? No. About these, what he calls phony scandals, and Fox News has been eating, a breakfast, lunch, and dinner off of this. It really was about as disconnected a thing that he could have possibly said. Because whether or not he thinks that these, and his administration thinks that these things are phony scandals, to the people that are viewing it on the news, to his constituents, which is all of us, they are real. And they show facets of the Obama administration that he does not want us to see. At the end of the day, this is more evidence that this administration is totally unscrupulous, will do anything in its political aims, and at the end of the day, is business as usual. This is more evidence that Barack Obama and his administration is more of the same politically. About this, conspiring forces against the middle class, I agree with you guys. He's trying to say it's Republicans without actually saying it. And I think it's more than a little hypocritical for him to say that. Because you know what? Maybe to a point he can blame Republicans, but he can't blame Republicans for not closing Guantanamo. He can't blame Republicans for not doing what he said he was going to do.
What he said he would do.
And you know what? Republicans can't...
If he couldn't do it, he should have shut his mouth.
Be honest.
You can't say, I'm going to do this without any plan or any idea if it's even possible.
Yeah, I mean, he was making promises that either he couldn't keep or he was not willing to keep just to get elected, and that is wrong. So let's move on to this editorial. So basically, this Fox Business editorial said, it begins with, did you listen to President Obama's speech on the economy the other day? No, me neither. What little I could stomach sounded like the same old partisan politics, pointless policies, finger-pointing, and pandering to middle-class voters. Not to mention all the BS. If I stood up in front of a Silicon Valley company I was running and tried to blow that much smoke up everyone's you-know-what, the employees would call me out on it. Franco, did the speech sound disingenuous to you, like the writer seems to indicate? Go to Annika. Do you think that this speech is disingenuous?
Of course it is. I don't listen to him. I cannot stand the sound of his voice. It just grates on my nerves. And I mean, at this point, he knows he's done. Okay, there's nothing he can do. Even if he gets impeached, they'll still keep him in office. We'll get Bill Clinton impeached, still in office. He doesn't care. And he knows, we all know he doesn't care. And I think that's the big thing.
So I have to ask you, and I agree with you, I think a large part of the American public, conservatives, far-right people and far-left people, socialists, communists, whatever, anybody but sort of the liberals who kind of are lockstep with him. Why is there, after this charm is worn off so long ago, why is there still this contingent of MSNBC liberals who are still so lockstep with him and believing in him?
Because I'm not sure the exact reason. My opinion is that they helped get him elected, so they need to, they're trying to cover their asses and say, well, he really is good, he really is the Messiah,
Yeah.
He was great all along. We didn't make a mistake in helping get him elected.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I think. No one likes to look stupid.
Yeah, or
so
look like they would do.
They're doing everything they can to look less stupid.
And yes, Obama went through the media for himself to get reelected. Yes. But
he got man out himself.
I just voted
One person at a time needs to speak. Franco.
Because I just voted him because I didn't want a Republican in office.
Well, you were one of many, one of millions, in fact, who was fooled into thinking that there were only two choices. Sorry to interrupt you. Continue talking.
Well, there were only two realistic choices.
Well, there's realistic and then there's honesty. The essence of democracy, as I said in a previous episode, is doing what you truly believe in, and still, despite if it's not popular. And you know what? Maybe the other people would not have got elected, but at least you could have elected with a clear conscience. No, Franco, continue with what you were saying. Actually, I would ask this question to you. So you voted for Obama. At the time, did you believe that he would bring real change?
No, I at the time, as far as results, I didn't see any results. I am trained I'm going to school to become a medical doctor because I don't think that politics is a way, an avenue to help the people. I just feel that, yes, although treating somebody physically temporarily, you're not treating them in their other aspects, but at least I am treating them. At least I'll be helping them.
Yes.
But as far as why I voted for him, I just didn't want the other candidate to get into office.
So I have to ask you this question: If politics doesn't,
Wait a minute. What's wrong with Mitt?
What's wrong with what?
With Mitt.
Well, we're not talking about Mitt Romney right now.
No, you said he didn't want the other one to get to be president.
Well, that's something.
So what was wrong with Mitt?
That's a conviction that I share as well. But we can talk about Mitt Romney here. Let's stay back on topic. Franco, so if politics as it exists here does not benefit the people at large, who does it benefit?
As far as the Guantanamo Bay, it's exhausting.
I'm sure it's pretty exhausting to be in Guantanamo Bay as well.
Yes, of course it would be. I mean...
Let me move on in this editorial. It continues to say, the author says, here's what I think about the economy. It stinks. America's economic growth has virtually flatlined, and so has household income. Unemployment has been so high for so long, folks have given up looking for jobs. The cost of living is sky high, and people are moving jobs and capital offshore. The Treasury prints money while the Fed keeps interest rates down and stock prices up. What's wrong with this picture? Depending on which politician is doing the talking, you'll always get a different answer. But one thing's for sure, it's always the other guy's fault, the other party, the other branch of government. Annika, do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, that's my biggest issue with politics and a two-party system is when you only have, I should say, two major parties.
Yeah.
Two parties with any political clout.
Yeah.
All they do is argue. That's it. Nothing gets done
and because
they spend their entire time arguing.
Yes. Well, our country touts the fact that it, is a competitive economy. Why don't we extend those values to the political arena? Republicans and Democrats can afford to argue and do nothing because there's no realistic challenger to them. Many people.
They only serve 150 days a year.
Yeah. So many people think that they have no other choice, and the Republicans and Democrats feel like they have nothing to lose because who else are we going to choose?
Right, and that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. What about you, Franco? Do you agree?
Yes, I agree because I'm one of those people that just didn't really have a choice. Well, I do have a choice.
Well, you didn't feel like you did.
Of putting my vote for another party, but I just felt like I would be wasting my vote for at least electing a guy who has similar political ideas that I do. I just felt like I would be throwing my vote if I just voted for a third party.
I really
no matter how much
in voting now, it's the lesser of two evils. That's how I viewed it. Who are you voting for? The guy that's going to do less bad than the other guy, but they'll both do that. I mean, Somebody once said to me, who are you voting for, the devil or the Antichrist?
I feel like a lot of people have that attitude, but I think that really shows the mediocratic, the mediocrity that is this country today. The fact that people are so demoralized and they don't believe in democracy that they go to the polls, the people who even bother to vote, and they say, I'm voting for the least bad thing. Should that be how American democracy is working?
No, and that's the other thing. Are we a democracy or are we a republic?
Well,
a combination of both.
I think we need to take a good, hard look at our economic system and our political system and ask ourselves, we portray ourselves as the beacon of true democracy. Are we really living up to that? But let's move on in this editorial. So it says, President Obama can talk about it for more than an hour and not even come close to getting it straight. We always talk about bubbles, how insidious, destructive, and of course unsustainable they are. The high-tech industry had won. Americans lost trillions. Same thing with housing. That nearly started a Great Depression. Now Washington, our entire federal government, has become a bubble. As with all bubbles, everyone inside it is fat, dumb, and happy. They all live and work in a complete state of denial of their situation. So this is comparing completely different systems, and is it fair to charge that government is trying to steer the country, while trying to steer the country out of recession, that it is creating, quote unquote, a bubble? That's a term that is normally employed towards economics, towards business. Annika, do you think this is an appropriate terminology?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to something, that I said on one of the previous shows, that we really weren't in a recession. We were in a depression.
Yeah.
But everyone's afraid to throw around the word because it's a big, scary word. And we're the same way. Everybody's afraid to use the appropriate words for things because they're afraid to scare someone else.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it doesn't matter. Maybe scaring the shit out of people is a good thing every once in a while.
Yeah.
Because we need to get scared to maybe take some action.
Yeah. I feel like this editorial is trying to associate the taint that has come with the recession and the bubbles with the government and, the Fed manipulating the currency. I feel like those are two different things, and I think it is false for conservatives to to remove the barrier between the two and just say they're all creating a bubble. No. I would say that, these industries have created a bubble. The Fed is manipulating the market and the interest rates, and I'm not going to deny that either of those exists, but I think that it kind of blurs the lines, to use this word bubble, for the government.
Wait a minute. What's the Fed supposed to do if not mess with the interest rate and trying to keep it down? That's what they were created to do. That is their sole purpose.
Well, this editorial would say, well, that's causing a bubble.
I don't know.
Well, let's move on. So basically it says, if you got away with this type of behavior, you would be bankrupt, like Dionne Warwick. There's enough legacy prosperity in America to fund it for decades more. So if it feels like to you like we're still in a recession, join the club. But there is one thing all bubbles have in common. No matter how big they are, they eventually have to burst. It happened to the Soviet Union, and it will happen to America. I would have to disagree. In that this happened to the Soviets. They had a world largely opposed to them and didn't even have a market economy. How could they suffer from a bubble? I think, again, he's making a false comparison there. Here's, my kind of final word on this before we go to break and move on. I do believe that Barack Obama is using this rhetoric very cynically. I think that he's disingenuous, and I think this is not just conjecture, it is borne out by his policies. The liberals that did get him elected, I agree, Annika, they don't want to believe that they were duped. No one wants to admit that they were wrong. And not wrong in the sense that I think this policy is wrong, that policy is wrong, but in the fact that they bought into somebody who was selling a false bill of goods. He did not, and probably never intended to do, some of the radical, change America, not business as usual kind of policies that he said he would. He basically, provided America with false advertising. And I think that a lot of these liberals, I think a lot of them are intelligent, and if they really were honest with themselves, they could come to the realization that this person was not who he sold himself out to be, and that they were fooled and they were used by this amazing media machine and by the brand that is Barack Obama. But again, they don't want to admit it. It is painful to admit that you are wrong, and that hurts. You have to check the ego at the door, and some people can't do that. And in terms of this usage of the bubble, again, I'm speaking with the bubble as it refers to economics. There is economic manipulation by the Fed. Our currency is based on nothing. It's a fiat currency.
But that's their job. Their job is to do that.
Well, sure, but I mean, I have to say,
You're saying there's manipulation, and I'm saying,
I know, but I am. I don't think that's the only the only way forward is economic manipulation through the Fed. But I think it is kind of a false comparison to call, the Fed's, am I supporting the Fed's, recent measures to continue to keep interest rates artificially low? No, I don't support that, because I think, we are trumpeting ourselves as this capitalist economy, but at the same time, we're not sticking by free market principles. Well, okay, if you can't, if you have this Fed that employs and manipulates your economy just trying to get some sort of economic success, how can you say that capitalism is the best system if it's collapsing all around you and it takes this much, economic manipulation by this organ? Again, I would say that a bubble is not appropriate. I think it's manipulation. I think it's artificial, but I don't think it's a bubble. In terms of when you brought up fear, Annika, I think that, politicians do use fear, and they use it a lot, especially in the post 9/11 era. But the thing is they use fear selectively, and they use it to push the policies that they want, pass. They push policies not to empower the people, and they don't stoke the flames of fear to empower people, but to manipulate them. And I think especially with terrorism, with Obama being called a socialist, with, recently, the Tea Party, what fueled the Tea Party, a lot of that was fear that wasn't necessarily for the common good.
A lot of Republicans hate the Tea Party too, so,
I don't think that our statements are mutually exclusive. I do think that fear fueled the Tea Party. And I think that fear was not necessarily conducive to the common good or even sustained political activism. And finally, I think this, editor or this, the author of this editorial is kind of playing it both ways. Like Annika, like you said, we are still in a depression, or as you would term it, a depression. And he says that on the one hand, that we are still in an economic, downturn. But at the same time, he's saying,
we're in a recession, but I think we were in a depression.
So he's saying that we're in an economic recession, but at the same time, he's saying that we're in a bubble. Which one is it? You have, when you have to choose. And finally, of course, I said my, objections to bringing the Soviet Union into this. I don't think that's even a comparison that you can make, because, find one area in the Soviet Union's economic life when it was in a bubble. I'm more of a supporter of the Soviet Union than most Americans, almost all Americans, but you're not going to find an economic bubble in the sense that we understand it. So any more comments that you guys have on those issues before we move on?
Well, I can talk about you supporting the Soviet Union.
That's not the issue. Well, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about the fine line that a Republican nominee for president has to straddle between too conservative and not conservative enough to be able to get the nomination. We'll be right back.